So anyway, of course, we're continuing talking about now today the end of the Cold War. I believe we were originally talking about the period under like Ronald Reagan's coming in after Jimmy Carter's administration that we had. So that's about where we're at from before. So I'm going to talk about that period from the 1980s up to whatever I can do today. I don't know how far I'll get, but I'll try to get as far as I can to the present that we have. And talk a little about Reagan's administration. Reagan was in power for 2 terms from 1981 to 1989. And Reagan was mostly known for a lot of his foreign policy issues that he did in the 1980s, which they think a lot of his policies, in a sense, led to the end of the Cold War era. They really usually give him credit for that, even though really it doesn't really end until George H.W. Bush comes in, serves 1 term from 1989 to 1993. So yeah, a lot of his policies helped in the Cold War in general. So he was known for that, which I'll talk about that later, about some things that Reagan did as the 40th president of the United States. And domestic, let me talk about domestic stuff he did first, which is well known. Of course, the thing that he's most known for, if you know about Reagan, Reagan's one that came in and did a lot of tax cuts, which the taxes were real high, before that, going back to the 1970s and before that. And so he did a lot of cuts to like non-military spending was one thing he did. He also eliminated a lot of federal regulations. It's kind of like what Donald Trump has done, I think, under his administration, doing all these, tax cuts. And it did create like an economic boom later. I think by the 90s, they think it led into like the Clinton era, where Clinton had, all that economic boom that he had later. And a lot of his economic policies were later called Reaganomics, is what they call. Some people call it trickle down economics, I think was another nickname they called it as well. But the only bad thing about Reagan was that all these tax cuts he did also led to a lot of increase in defense spending, because the reason why Reagan did that was because he was trying to somehow defeat the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And one way they did that was to increase a lot of spending, like with the military, which they did. So that led to a lot of federal debt. And under him, by the time Bush and Clinton came in later, the actual federal deficit became a lot more, of course, later. So I was talking about tax cuts. Yeah, so the Tax Reform Act was one thing, of course, that did that as an example. They had that. Also, Reagan was the one that did immigration reform. He actually gave amnesty to like 3 million illegals under it, something that hasn't been done in a long time, which probably needs to be done again. But Reagan was the last guy to actually, do that as well. We saw the little video. I just told you about that, of course, about the John Hinckley attempt to assassinate Ronald Reagan, which happened on March 30th, 1981 in Washington, D.C. And Hinckley was actually trying to impress some girl, who I think was an actress. I forget her name. I think it was Jodie Foster or something like that. And he tried to shoot. I think he was mentally deranged because he was in mental hospitals after that for a long time. But Reagan survived the incident after surgery, but 3 men were wounded. They talked about in the video. James Brady was Reagan's press secretary. He was shot in the head. There was a police officer, of course, you see there, also shot too. And then a Secret Service man, Tim McCarthy, that was the guy they were talking about. He was also shot too, as well. And because of the attempted assassination on Reagan, it led to the Brady Act or Brady Bill, they sometimes called it, which created a lot of regulations on firearms in the United States. And one thing it did that was very famous, the Brady Bill or Brady Act, was it forced people to have background checks. So when you buy like a firearm, that's why they do a background check on you. And initially, they would have a 5-day waiting period before you could buy a pistol or gun or whatever, hand or rifle or whatever it is. But now they have it's pretty much instant now that they can check if you have some kind of issue. Now, the thing that Reagan is mostly known for as president of the United States, of course, which I'll talk about next, Ronald Reagan, is that Reagan, of course, is the one that, like I said, helped in the Cold War because of his anti-communist stance that he held against the Soviet Union, which became known as the so-called Reagan Doctrine, as they nickname it. So they kind of rolled back, the global influence of the Soviet Union, which is true. And Reagan was the one, if you know about it, that called the Soviet Union the evil empire that needed to be ended. And he did this in different ways. One was he continued what Jimmy Carter had started to do in the 70s and all that. They began to, they continued basically to support the Muslim rebels that were fighting basically in Afghanistan, the Mujahideen, like Osama bin Laden. They basically started, giving him more money, weapons to basically fight the Soviet Union. And so it became like this proxy war that the United States was kind of fighting against the Soviets over there. Also, he got the Soviet Union into an arms race, was something he did. But we started to expand our military more. That forced the Soviet Union to do the same thing. And so they think that was part of why the Soviet Union would collapse later. So they were trying to compete with us and couldn't really do it. And then also they had all the problems, within their own country, economically, politically. And then they had the Afghan war. And of course, that hurt them as well. Reagan also came up with this thing called Star Wars. I don't know if you've heard about the Star Wars program called SDI, or Strategic Defensive Initiative. It was this idea to create satellites in space that could shoot down like nuclear weapons, by the Soviets, create like a nuclear umbrella they talked about. And that really was something they think that kind of forced the Soviets to kind of do some stuff that eventually led to their demise later. Of course, they always talk about Reagan and Gorbachev. That's something that's very famous. Reagan and Gorbachev. What's going on my screen there? Lost it for a second. Sorry. But bring that back up. Lost it. But Mikhail Gorbachev was the last major ruler of the Soviet Union. He was premier, and then later, I think at the end of it, he was also president of the Soviet Union. What happened was, about what occurred between him and Gorbachev. Gorbachev and him eventually started meeting. I think around 1985, they started having these peace summits together. They embarked to try to maybe end the Cold War, to prevent, nuclear war from happening. And so one of the things that they did that was very famous, they created a bunch of treaties with each other that would limit nuclear weapons, which the most famous was the INF Treaty, which you may have heard of, called the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, usually called INF for short, which would reduce nuclear armaments on like short and intermediate range, is what it was mostly. And I think there were various ranges where you couldn't have nuclear weapons, which were mostly in that range. So ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, missile launchers, you couldn't have ranges that were like 310 to 620 miles and 620 to 3,420 miles. They had to be like long range. You can only have long range missiles, basically, and nothing short and intermediate, basically. And this was important because over time it led to elimination of almost 2,700 missiles on both sides combined, which kind of helped to prevent nuclear war and all that. And then Reagan became famous for going to Berlin in 1987, where he made his famous speech, probably his greatest speech he made as president at the end of the Cold War, where he told Gorbachev to tear down this wall, to tear down the Berlin Wall. And I think it's partially what caused, I think, the Soviet Union to eventually decline under him, because it forced Gorbachev to make a bunch of reforms to the state, which would eventually lead to the end of course, the Cold War. And Gorbachev had these new ideas he came out with, if you know about it, as the leader of the Soviet Union. One was called glasnost, and the other was called perestroika. And glasnost meant openness. The other one meant restructuring. And Gorbachev created more freedoms in the country. And he also brought in some capitalism. They think that actually helped to lead to eventually the end of the Soviet Union later, which happens in 1991 is when it will actually happen. Going back up, of course, to talk about Reagan. Now, Reagan had other things that happened too that's well known as well. In his second term, there was a deal where they had this thing called Iran-Contra that came out, so-called Iran-Contra affair. And this was a deal where apparently what happened was the U.S. military was creating an arms for hostage deal with Iran. If you remember going back to what happened with the whole Iranian Revolution, if you remember correctly, Reagan was able to get the hostages out. Well, this is kind of how it was done. And what it was, they basically gave weapons to Iran via Israel, is what happened. But what happened was apparently the money was siphoned off to some anti-communist guerrilla forces that were in Nicaragua that were called the Contras. They were fighting this communist group in Nicaragua. It was called the Sandinistas. And apparently Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North was the one involved in getting some of that money sent over to aid the Contras, which was actually illegal because it was really without Congress's knowledge about what was going on. North was actually arrested, indicted for it. Became a big scandal at the end of Reagan's term, and when George H.W. Bush came in, but I think Reagan by that time was starting to get Alzheimer's and didn't really know what was going on. So he was getting pretty old. So now, after Reagan served 2 terms, they then had George H.W. Bush came in. He became, of course, the next president that would come in. And I think I've got a picture of Bush, which is right here. Yeah, George H.W. Bush. And he, of course, was vice president, of course, under Reagan originally. And elected president in 1988, defeating Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts, I think pretty much in a landslide. And he became the 43rd president. And, of course, he's the father of George W. Bush, who will later be president. It's the only time where you've had a father and son president, except John Adams and John Quincy Adams, which was the second time it's only happened, where a father and son were both president, basically. He, of course, only served 1 term. But one thing that is famous about the Bush administration, under him, the Cold War actually ended. The Berlin Wall, of course, fell first, which I think started opening up December of 1989. That was one of the things that really helped to precipitate the whole end of the Cold War. Germany then, the next year in 1990, reunified. So East and West Germany became one state. East Germany, of course, it's not East Germany, Eastern Europe, then after that, all the countries that were originally communist overthrew the communist regimes. They brought in like democracy and capitalism in Eastern Europe after that. And then, of course, it culminated with the collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991. This all happened like in 2 years. I remember I was in high school and college when all this happened, when the end of the Cold War actually occurred. And Mikhail Gorbachev, of course, eventually stepped down as the last and only president of the Soviet Union. which he would in 1991. And so the Russians then put in basically a democratic republic, which it still is today. And Boris Yeltsin, of course, was our first president of that country. Then, of course, now the current one is Vladimir Putin today. I do have some other slides, of course, about some of the stuff that happened. Yeah, here's, of course, pictures of the Berlin Wall before it fell. Of course, there's a famous picture. That's probably one of the most famous pictures where they're sitting there hammering out the wall there, which would take them like between 1989 and 1990 to actually tear it down and all that. So now we're getting into the post-Cold War era that comes in, of course, afterwards, which I need to talk about next today. Get that out of the way. And of course, one of the first big things that happened under George H.W. Bush, if you know about it, something that happened with Saddam Hussein. You've probably heard of Saddam Hussein, of course, the famous ruler of Iraq, of course, who'd been really in power for, I think, up to like maybe 24 years, going back to the late 70s and all of that. So you have the Persian Gulf War, or just called the Gulf War for short. So that would break out, of course, in, of course, President Bush's administration. This is George H.W. Bush we're talking about. And what happened was in August of 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded the kingdom of Kuwait, which was to the south of Iraq. And it precipitated, of course, a conflict later that was called all kinds of names. We'll call it the Gulf War for short, Persian Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, of course, for short. That's what they usually called it. Actually, a Desert Shield, which they had before that. And it would last about 6 months, this conflict between 1990 to 1991. And right before that, the conflict happened, the U.S. formed a coalition with multiple states, Britain, France, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other countries, Arab states got involved in it. And we eventually amassed forces in what is Saudi Arabia, and basically to expel the Iraqis who had basically occupied Kuwait at that point. And it started with an aerial naval bombardment first, which started at the beginning of 1991. January 17th, we basically started attacking them first, mostly with an aerial type war first, which we did over several weeks, which I think they called that Operation Iraqi. Oh, what's it called? Yeah, Desert Shield, I think is what they called it originally. Then that was followed by the ground assault, which that didn't take long. It only took a few days, more or less. From February 24th to February 28th, the coalition forces basically overwhelmed the Iraqis in Kuwait and also in southern Iraq. It didn't last long. It lasted about 100 hours. That's about how long the whole conflict was, pretty much the whole ground campaign. It was that quick, pretty much. And Bush declared a ceasefire on February 28th, ending the war. So it was a very lopsided battle. We only suffered something like 300 casualties on the coalition side, 300 deaths, 300 killed. That's about it. And I think the Iraqis, they're not sure, anywhere from 25,000 to 50,000 were killed in the actual conflict. We kicked their butt, pretty much, is what happened. But the only thing is, though, they left Saddam in power. That was the only thing. If you read, I've got some other slides. We'll look at them later. We left Saddam in power. That was the only problem about it. Left him in there. And, of course, this would, of course, create a problem later, as you know. And they did put sanctions on, Saddam and Iraq afterwards. They put these no-fly zones, too, in the north and south to protect the Kurds and the Shiite minorities in the country. But obviously, it didn't really, solve the problem because later, after the 9/11 attacks, what would happen? We'd end up going back over there again in 2003 under President George W. Bush. You had the second Iraq War, or just Iraq War, usually called Operation Iraqi Freedom, of course. And we would go back in there as well. But that was the peak. Really, the Gulf War was really the peak of Bush's administration. Like he was very popular at that point after the Persian Gulf War and all of that. But later into his term, like 91, 92, if you know about it, there was a bad recession that came in. And then that was made on top of that. The other problem he had, of course, too, if you know about it, was that Bush had also raised taxes. And there was a case where he had run for president in 1988 against Dukakis at the RNC. He had made this famous statement where he said that he wouldn't raise taxes. He said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." That was his famous phrase he spoke that came back to haunt him later. And eventually, because of that, along with the recession, he eventually lost re-election to Bill Clinton, who would eventually defeat him in 1992. In fact, Clinton even used it against him when he ran for president in 1992. So that's kind of basically, what happened under Bush. Here's some more pictures if you want to look at it. Here's a map showing you Operation Desert Storm. Of course, the top two generals that were under the Americans you probably heard of was Norman Schwarzkopf. You've heard of him, and Colin Powell. They were the two big generals that were involved in the Operation Desert Storm. And of course, later, Colin Powell would be Secretary of State under George W. Bush's administration. So there's another slide if you want to look at that as well. Now, of course, Bill Clinton came in next as president and kind of talk a little bit about who he was, Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, if you know much about him, was the governor of Arkansas. And he, of course, was one of a couple men that challenged George H.W. Bush for the presidency in 1992. The other guy I'll get to later, of course, was Ross Perot. Of course, that also ran. Not sure if I got a picture of Ross Perot. I might. But Clinton, the only thing about Clinton was people liked him a lot. And he was very popular in Arkansas and in the South. But he had like marital issues, which is something that they kind of starts coming out about that, which was even in the news media and all that. And there was an incident about Jennifer Flowers. Have you heard about her? Where he actually had to go on TV and admit and say he didn't have an affair with her and all that. And actually found out later he did have an affair with her, because I think in the impeachment trial he admitted that he had the affair later on. But Ross Perot, of course, was another guy that ran too, also in the 1992 election. He was a billionaire from Texas. He also ran in 1996 as well. He ran twice for president. Ran as an independent, Ross Perot. I thought I had Ross Perot. Let me see if I do or no. I don't know if I got him. I don't think I've got Ross Perot as far as I know. But yeah, I don't look like I do. But anyway, Ross Perot, he ran on this idea of a couple things. One was he wanted to reduce the federal budget. He thought the budget was getting too much, too high, and so he became real popular. He actually got 20 million votes, I think is correct, in the actual. I think it was like 20 million, some good amount, like pretty good for a third party guy running anyway. And and then he ran as this non-politician, kind of like Donald Trump did later, which is why Trump kind of got elected, because he was kind of seen as a non-politician and all of that. So yeah, that was appealing, but Clinton was more popular, and Clinton ran on the right thing. He concentrated more on the economy. That's why he got elected. In fact, James Carville, or Jim Carville, they called him too, who's from Louisiana. You probably heard of him. Was the campaign manager for for Bill Clinton, I think in 92 and 96. And he ran on the economy. And he basically came up with like a slogan like, "It's the economy, stupid." I think was the big slogan they used, basically telling Bush that that's the real problem, this administration, the economy. And then also they also went after Bush because he raised taxes as well. That didn't help either. So Bill Clinton would end up winning the election. He got 370 electoral votes. But it's really weird about the 92 election. He won as a minority candidate. He only got 43% of the popular vote because you had three people running, George H.W. Bush and Ross Perot. So if you study about it, it's since, going back to World War II, there's only been, you've only had at least four incumbent presidents that have lost. Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush, and now I guess we got Donald Trump as well. So that's basically true, about that. Let me talk about some of the things that Clinton was known for domestically. Of course, during his time, he served 2 terms. Bill Clinton, of course, he won in 96 as well against Bob Dole. And Clinton was known for a bunch of domestic stuff, which the most famous thing he did, you may have heard about, is NAFTA. He's the one that eventually agreed to it and signed off on it. But NAFTA really had something that had been developed by George H.W. Bush, like under him, called the North American Free Trade Agreement, is what it meant. And it was this trade agreement that was made between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. It was basically a trilateral trade bloc, you can see there is what it was. And it went into effect in 1994. Now, the only thing about NAFTA, which became controversial, about it, was that some economists later think that it hurt Americans, like American jobs and all that, because after NAFTA happened, if you know what happened, all these corporations started moving to Canada, moving to Mexico, and all that. And so a lot of Americans lost their jobs because of that. So it's been a lot of criticism toward it, which I think is really true about that. And it was later replaced by this new agreement that Trump came up with, which is called the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which, of course, they came up with, which this created a more balanced trade environment and business environment between the 3 countries, U.S., Canada, and Mexico. And it supported a lot of more higher paying jobs, because I think that was one of the problems of NAFTA, was that they had jobs, but it was more like less paying jobs, which was one of the big problems that they had. So Clinton was known for that, NAFTA, and then Trump later replaced it with that, the other one. Bill Clinton was also known for some other stuff, welfare reform. Like under welfare reform, he made it mandatory that you couldn't just get welfare. You had to, be looking for work or trying to find work to get welfare, as an example. He's also known for the 1994 crime bill, which sometimes has some controversy with it as well. Which, it's one of the largest crime bills ever made in the United States by the federal government overall. And they spent something like $9.7 billion on funding prisons, like creating more prisons. They actually provided for more police officers in 100,000 that it provided for. $6.1 billion was also used for funding, you can see, prevention programs that you hear about today. I think DARE, you heard of DARE? There's those anti-drug programs. I think a lot of that was kind of created because of that. And Joe Biden's the guy that drafted it. Of course, there was a senator in Delaware who's likely going to be president, the 46th president coming up. If they ever figure out what to do with the election and all that, I don't know what's going on with that. But you can see, you may have seen some of these, you may have heard of this, like the crime bill had stuff, the federal assault weapons ban, the federal death penalty act was in there, violence against women act, that's a big one, still around today, that's still around. That was all part of the whole crime bill as examples that were things that went in it overall. Now, under Clinton, though, like in the mid 90s, there was a resurgence in conservatism that followed. Like in the midterms of 94, what happened was the Republicans seized control of the House of Representatives, which they hadn't had control of in a long time. They took it over. And they also had it under George W. Bush. This happened before, like later. That'll happen like in the early 2000s. They do the same thing as well. And if you know about it, Newt Gingrich came in. Newt Gingrich, if you know about it, was the Speaker of the House in the mid to late 90s. And Gingrich was important. He was the one that forced Clinton to balance the federal budget. They even had a bunch of cases where they had like had these budget deals where they what was it? They shut down the government for a while because he wouldn't do all that and make reforms. And he was also the one behind the whole welfare reform. So I think they say Clinton did all this was mostly because of Gingrich, wanted to do all these things. And then Gingrich is later the one that they think is behind maybe the whole impeachment of Bill Clinton because they start digging up dirt on him later on. That's the thing that's famous about Bill Clinton at the end of his time in office. You have, of course, the famous Monica Lewinsky thing that happens. There's of course, the Brady bill, which I just talked about earlier, which of course they had too as well. But yeah, the Clinton impeachment, that's one of the big things that really dominates the end of Clinton's administration. And was kind of marred by that. And of course, there were a bunch of things they investigated, like Whitewater. You may have heard of that thing where there was some kind of deal with some kind of real estate issues with Bill and Hillary Clinton. I know was a problem they had. Then they had the Monica Lewinsky thing where he apparently had an affair with a White House intern. This broke because I think Linda Tripp, who I think worked also at the White House, basically is the one that was the whistleblower about it. And it became big, and so it led to his impeachment. And the main thing that happened was there was a woman named Paula Jones that basically sued him for sexual harassment. And so this was the main thing that really led to why he got impeached, more or less. And from Clinton's testimony, he basically denied that he didn't have sex with Monica Lewinsky. I think what was his statement that he said famously? He said, I did not have sexual relations with that woman, I think is what Miss Lewinsky, I think is what he said. And of course, it turned out to be not, she had the blue dress, if you know about that. Turned out to be true about it. And of course, they find out that he committed perjury, Clinton. And so he was actually disbarred. He couldn't practice law anymore after that because he lied on the stand. And eventually he went to an impeachment trial in the U.S. Senate, which lasted from 1998 to 1999. I remember I was in graduate school when this was all going on. And so Clinton ends up becoming the second president to be impeached in American history. I think the third now is Donald Trump, as you know. And but he was acquitted. In February of 1999, he was acquitted basically on all counts, 2 counts they had against him. Basically, I forget how long it was. I think it was like 5 or 6 votes away or something like that from being convicted and removed from office. But it definitely hurt him after that. I think that's kind of maybe why Hillary Clinton lost in 2016 because people were still kind of thinking about, that issue with Monica Lewinsky and all that. And you got to wonder about some of the things he's kind of been known for. He was kind of a philanderer, it seems like it to me. All right. Then, of course, the other thing that happened after Clinton went out, you then had the 2000 election happen that followed next. The 2000 election. And in that election, you had, of course, Al Gore, which was Clinton's vice president, who was from Tennessee, ran against George W. Bush. He was the son of, George H.W. Bush. He was also the governor of Texas at the time. He became the Republican nominee. And so those two eventually would, that's the two that would eventually end up together campaigning against each other in the year 2000. That election, of course, was not ordinary. If you know about it, it became one of the closest and disputed elections in American history since, I want to say, the 1876 election. I remember between Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes. And the dispute had to do with the electoral votes in Florida. It was such a close election. And I'm talking about like I think how long it was, like a few hundred votes, I think is how close it was. It was crazy how close it was. And so they had to have a recount. And eventually it led to like a lawsuit where Bush sued Al Gore. Basically, they call it Bush versus Gore. So it led to this legal battle, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Bush winning the electoral votes, which it ended up being, by the way, I think I forget what it was, but it was, I don't think that was really exact right there. I think it was 281 to 270. I don't think that's correct what I got. I think it's 277 to 281, I think is what it was the total electoral votes. I think I've got it right here. I'll bring it up, which is right here to get that correct or not. But yeah, 271 to 266, I'm sorry, was the actual electoral vote. So 5 electoral votes, basically. And there's the Florida 25 electoral votes, of course, that went to George W. Bush because of that. So that was kind of one of the most famous things that happened, I guess, at the beginning of the, getting into the 21st century at that point. All right, then, of course, kind of get into George H.W. Bush's, what happened under him. Of course, you know about at the beginning of Bush's administration, they had the September 11th attacks that occurred, now called, 9/11. These were a series of terrorist attacks that were done by Al-Qaeda, which you've heard about, which was based in the Middle East, like in Afghanistan, Pakistan. And it's believed that these attacks were coordinated and masterminded by Osama bin Laden. At least they theorize about it today. Some people think maybe not. But Osama bin Laden may have been one of the guys that masterminded the attacks that occurred. And what happened was Al-Qaeda came up with this idea to seize commercial airliners like United, I think it was United and American Airlines, and they used them to basically attack different targets in the United States, with the main ones being the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Oh, and also they were going to try to target the White House. That was one thing they were supposedly trying to do, if you know about it, was they tried to, one of the planes was going to hit the White House. I think it ended up, if you know about it, crashing in Pennsylvania, all of that. And the attacks ended up taking down the Twin Towers. They were both destroyed. I remember when when this happened, actually, I was actually teaching my first semester as a teacher. I think I was at Lee High School. I taught at Lee High School a long time ago in Baton Rouge, so they used to call it. I was in August 2000. I was in 2001. I think when I first started teaching, and I remember just exactly where I was, when this all happened. It basically it happened on Tuesday morning, September 11, 2001, and resulted in like almost 3,000 people got killed in the terrorist attacks in New York City, Washington, and of course the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania as well. And you can see the amount of damage that was done. $10 billion. Infrastructure, property were all destroyed, of course, in this attack. And, it caused a kind of an economic downturn right after, because Wall Street kind of like crashed for a while, of course, because of it. So it was one of the deadliest attacks on American soil since, I want to say, Pearl Harbor in 1941, which was, 60 years later. I guess it's kind of weird how that happened. It's also the most single day you can see there where you had over 400 something law enforcement, like police, firefighters, were all killed and wounded in one day with this actual attack. So it was one of the deadliest attacks, on American soil that's ever happened. And of course, we're still kind of reeling from it today. It's still kind of an issue today. A lot of people still are ill from it, from all the fallout that came, of course, from the attack. What happened afterwards, the U.S. then responded with what's called the War on Terror, which started right afterwards in 2001. And we believe that al-Qaeda was being supported by the Taliban, which was this Islamic terrorist organization, military political organization that was in Afghanistan. And so we eventually invaded Afghanistan in 2001 to try to take out Taliban and also take out al-Qaeda, worldwide. That became the so-called War on Terror, as they would call it. Later, we would kill Osama bin Laden, but it would be not until 2011 when they actually killed him. But that was under Barack Obama, of course, when that would occur, when the famous Navy SEALs took him out later on. Now, of course, talking about George W. Bush's administration, there's a lot of things that happened under him. Of course, that's, of course, well known. Oh, and by the way, I forgot about this, but the U.S. also passed this thing called the Patriot Act. We got to talk about that. But that was something that did come out of, by the way, the whole War on Terror and all that in September 11th attacks. And so we passed that as a strict means to basically surveil the people, like the United States, and try to prevent any kind of terrorism in the United States. So-called Patriot Act, which of course they call it today. I don't know if I have anything on the Patriot Act much on there, but let me go ahead and move on. Of course, the last things that of course happened. Talk about the Bush presidency. Of course, President Bush, of course, later in his, of course, time in office, they had a lot of negative things, of course, happen under him. Of course, that happened. Of course, the big thing that happened after 9/11 was, of course, the invasion of Iraq that followed. And the Bush administration, of course, bungled into the so-called Iraq War, Operation Iraqi Freedom, or you want to call it the Second Gulf War, if you want to dub it that. And the U.S. government accused Saddam Hussein of possessing weapons of mass destruction, mostly like poison gas, etc. And he also accused them of supporting terrorists like al-Qaeda, etc. Also because of his mistreatment of religious minorities like the Kurds in northern Iraq, Shiites, of course, in southern Iraq, and all of that. And so basically in 2003, the next war started, of course, the Second Iraq War, of course, as they call it sometimes as well. And we amassed another coalition force, this time about 300,000 troops in this one, which included mostly U.S. and Britain. I think were the only ones that really put up most of the forces. And then no Arab forces really got involved in this one. It was kind of disputed with that. A lot of them really weren't in support of it. But the U.S. was really mostly the one that went and tried to get, of course, Saddam out of Iraq, which they probably should have done under George H.W. Bush. And they call it Operation Iraqi Freedom. What happened was in March of 2003, the coalition forces invaded Iraq from what is Saudi Arabia again. And it only lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks, we toppled Saddam Hussein's administration as his government was toppled at that point. And Saddam, if you know what happened to him, he was later captured right after the war ended. And he was eventually put on trial for war crimes. And 3 years later, he was executed in 2006. So we basically toppled him and his regime. However, what happened afterwards, the United States then struggled afterwards to maintain control of Iraq because it became this insurgent war that occurred right afterwards that followed. And al-Qaeda, ISIS, and others, of course, would cause a lot of problems in Iraq. And it led to a lot of high casualties where a lot of American soldiers were wounded in the Iraq War, which would not end until 2011 when Barack Obama, withdrew, American forces from it. It actually led to close to 100,000 civilians were killed, by the way, in the Second Iraq War. It was much bloodier than the first one was. And tens of thousands of Americans were killed and wounded, which are still, you still see this today, all these soldiers that are wounded, from that, and of course, Afghanistan today. A few other things that happened also under Bush, which is well known, which I guess I'll talk a few minutes about as well. There's some domestic stuff that he did do. I guess I'll mention, positive things that Bush did do. That's well known. Bush was the one that created the No Child Left Behind Act. I guess that's one positive thing he did do that's well known, which created a lot of reforms in education throughout the United States. And that's one that created all these assessments tests. Like if you got to take the LEAP test and all those tests you got to take to graduate from high school, that was all done because of the No Child Left Behind Act. Because when I was in high school, we didn't do any of that stuff. We didn't take no assessment tests. You didn't have to do any of that stuff. I remember that. That was great. But anyway, and of course, brought tax cuts. He did a lot of tax cuts. I remember that. He did a lot of tax cuts and actually got money back, for a while there, believe it or not. But like I said, his administration was marred by a lot of problems. They had Hurricane Katrina, in 2005, which didn't help as well. That kind of showed how incompetent his administration was, especially in the second term. Then the Iraq War happened also as well, which dragged on too long, I think, in his administration, which lasted until Obama came in later. Great Recession, that was the thing in the end that really killed his administration, was really the Great Recession, as you know. And the country, of course, experienced a downturn in the economy, which was really caused by the housing bubble, where the housing market just imploded, if you know about that. And that's what caused a lot of the Great Recession to actually happen. And of course, a lot of people lost their jobs. Like both my brothers were unemployed for a bunch of years, or I don't know if a year, at least a year or so. I know they were unemployed. I know because of the Great Recession. I was kind of lucky because, I guess when they had this recession, everybody wanted to go back to college. And so that's why I stayed employed. It was mostly because of that. My wife's a nurse too. So she's like, everybody needs medical care anyway, no matter what happens. So that's what led to Barack Obama becoming president later, of course, who would be elected, in 2008. It was mostly, part of it was because of the recession was so bad and all that. Like under Bush, his approval rating at one point dropped to like 20%. That's serious. It was that low. It was 20%, his approval rate. I mean, people talk about not liking, Donald Trump, but Trump's actual approval rating is close to 50%. So it's kind of weird about that, how that is. But yeah, because of that, in the Great Recession, people started to make fun of, Bush, because of how bad it was. And Barack Obama, ends up getting elected president in the 2008 presidential election. Senator, of course, from Illinois and all that. And Obama would go on to defeat Arizona Senator John McCain, who was a ex-Vietnam War hero who had been shot down as a pilot in the Vietnam War. But Obama was just, I think, a better candidate. He was, great speaker. One thing about him, and of course, if you were around when, of course, he campaigned, it was just like, thousands and thousands of people would show up, of course, to watch Obama give speeches and all that. And of course, he ran against Hillary Clinton, who didn't do well. I remember seeing Clinton coming here. Clinton, I think. Actually, 2008, if I remember correctly, when I was still teaching at BRCC, Hillary Clinton came with Bill Clinton. They actually campaigned at BRCC. They actually had like a speech she gave and all that. I remember seeing that years ago. That's the only time I've ever seen an actual president like in real life. When I saw Clinton with her in 2008 at BRCC. That's kind of, that you didn't know that. But anyway, Barack Obama, of course, would easily beat McCain in a landslide. And Barack Obama, became the first African American president. That's something he's, of course, famous for. 44th president of the United States. And of course, as you know, his vice president, of course, was Joe Biden, senator from Delaware, who is likely going to be, of course, the 46th president of the United States after Trump. And so I've got a few minutes left. I could kind of go through and go ahead and talk about some of the things that happened under Obama that are, of course, are well known. Obama, his big thing that he did, of course, everybody's heard of the Affordable Care Act. That's the most famous thing he really did, probably in his administration, especially in the first term, of course. And so he created the ACA, which is called the Affordable Care Act, or now they call it the Obamacare, for nickname, as you know. So he did that. That's well known today. Also, Congress passed a lot of relief legislation under him to alleviate the Great Recession, which they did starting in 2009. And there's several things he did that's famous. One, of course, Dodd-Frank. If you know about Dodd-Frank, that was one big thing that Barack Obama really did, of course, which was it created this new federal law which regulated the banking industry and regulated the stock market, which had been a big problem. I think it also later they would also regulate a lot of the real estate stuff, because before, part of what caused the whole Great Recession was they were giving people houses like who couldn't afford it for like nothing, and so they made it real stricter to like buy houses unless you have the credit, to do it and all that. Because they had like people like janitors buying a house. It's like $500,000 and can't really afford it. That's actually happened. That was part of what caused the whole problem. Of course, they had the ARRA is what they called it, which was they call it Recovery Act for short, in 2009. That was a famous stimulus package, which they created in 2009 to help revitalize the economy, to create temporary relief programs for people with jobs in the country. It was more geared towards like education, healthcare, profession, infrastructure, and also renewable energy. It was an area that they started looking into under Barack Obama. Other things, of course, under administration, Barack Obama was the one that removed, the troops from Iraq, as you know, in 2011, which I think we pretty much need to do, which was kind of a problem. Obama was the one that helped kill Osama bin Laden off as well. So he was under him. That happened, I think it was at the end of 2000. I wonder when that was. It's sometime in 2011, I know when that was. And then Obama also served 2 terms as president, of course. He defeated Mitt Romney of Utah in the 2012 election as well. And so he would be in power until 2017. And of course, now, today, I guess the current president of the United States, as you know, is Donald Trump. As you know today, he's, of course, the current one now that we have, which, of course, is the 45th president of the United States. Of course, he defeated Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. A lot of this is like mostly current events we're talking about, of course, right now. I did have some other slides, like I've got stuff about that if you want to look at that later. Obamacare, what that was, Affordable Care Act, really. Here's, of course, a picture of a famous picture there, but a newspaper clipping, of course, of Osama bin Laden, of course, and of course, Obama announcing that they'd killed him in 2011 and all that. So I think that's pretty much it lecture-wise. I'm not sure if I'm reviewing the rest of that. That's pretty much, you can kind of go back through and look at that lecture to see all the materials we covered pretty much for the semester at the end, because pretty much the final exam is going to be, like I said, the Cold War era, starting under Harry S. Truman, and it's going to go all the way up to, I guess, the post-Cold War. I don't know if I have too many questions on that period, because a lot of this is like current events. That's kind of like stuff everybody knows, I guess, right now and all that. But that's going to be it for the semester. What I'm going to do is I'm going to work on the final exam over the weekend, get that wrapped up. And then I'm going to post all this stuff for you, of course. I think starting on Monday, I might have it up early for you to start working on the final exam if you want to do, just to get it up and ready to go. But don't forget, if you haven't turned in your book report yet, to do that. No, not your book report, your research paper. I meant your research paper. Yeah, make sure you get that to me if you haven't done it. And don't forget also, if you're doing that Veterans Oral History Project, that is due on Monday. Monday, November 30th. And so this is pretty much my last lecture for the History 2023 American History class. So hope you all had a good semester overall. I'm sorry we can't be face to face, and all that, I guess because of the virus and all that. But if you have any questions about this lecture and the previous ones before, let me know. A lot of you kind of shy about it. Don't want to ask me any comments, questions about it. There's, of course, that thing right there on YouTube. Of course, if you have an administrative question, let me know, of course, about the class as well. So I will basically put that all these lectures up later, and of course I'll have your final coming up also for you to kind of start working on. So that's pretty much it for the last lecture in the semester. So no lecture next week. We're pretty much finished for the semester, which is good. And at least we got up to like the present, which is kind of good, with that. So y'all take care. Hope you have a good weekend coming up. And I'll post all this stuff later for you for the final coming up. So take care.